So we have Heather Wilson presenting for us today, and she's going to help us from the teacher's perspective. So one thing that I really like about how we were able to design this symposium is that we're seeing how changes can be made at the different levels, because it is definitely something that requires a system-wide change to be the most effective. And it's not something that we can just wait and do. This is something that needs to be done today. It should have been done yesterday, but there are things that we can do to make the changes to our literacy instruction. And Heather's presentation is called Advice for Teachers Looking to Make a Change in Literacy Instruction.
Thank you, Catherine. So I'll dive right in. I'd like to begin the final presentation prior to the panel discussion today with the land acknowledgement. I know we're all over the place, tuning in from all over, but I would like to respectfully acknowledge that I am presenting to you today from Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, as well as the Métis. Together, we acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit whose footsteps have marked these lands for generations. We are grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. We recognize the land as an act of reconciliation and gratitude to those whose territory we reside on or are visiting. Thank you. So my name is Heather Wilson. I know my little moniker down there says Matthew Kierstead. We're just trying to minimize computer disruptions here. I am an early years teacher, elementary trained, special education trained, reading specialist, and learning support teacher. I've also been engaged in some consulting over the last couple of years, and I do have my master's in reading, writing, and oral language difficulties, which was part of, but not all of my journey, and certainly my journey is ongoing. The more I learn, the more I recognize I still have to learn. And so I'm really pleased to be here to present to you today. And I've been listening since the beginning of the presentations this morning. And so, one of the things that maybe I would just say before I get too far into it is some of the themes in my presentation may be familiar from some of the earlier presenters, and I think that there's some powerful thinking to take away from that. These things are important, and they're important not only from a systems, larger perspective, but also important from a classroom perspective as well. So what I hope to provide or present to you today is really my main challenge, which is the primary advice for teachers around professional learning. I'm going to suggest three larger areas for ongoing professional development and professional learning that can really impact your ability to support students in their literacy growth, regardless of what grade you're teaching and what your circumstances might be. And so within that, we've talked a lot about intervention today, and I'm going to shift the language a little bit to more of a response to instruction perspective. So classroom teachers have a role to play within the RTI framework. And so I'll talk a bit about that, not as much as I might have because it's been covered so well already by some of the other presenters. And I will also not going to give you a whole big, huge lecture, but just touch a little bit on some of the content knowledge that Dr. Kierstead had mentioned, which is, the entry point, the simple view of reading, and then the 5 pillars as identified by the National Reading Panel. And then jumping on those 5 pillars, take a look at some of that pedagogical knowledge, which are some key evidence-based instructional considerations and a few assessment suggestions for the less formal, so more progress monitoring type assessments that we may be using within our classrooms. So the first and overarching piece of advice is that we need to lean into our professionalism as teachers, and as such, we have an ongoing responsibility to continue to hone our craft, and our craft is teaching. And so, I did my BEd, I came out of there, I knew when I came out of there, I did not have the tools that I needed in order to be an effective teacher, particularly around reading, teaching kids to read. I really remember that actually, even in a particular class that I took, where I remember this moment in the class, and we're looking through these materials that were brought in, and I remember thinking to myself, I have no idea what to do with this stuff. They're not telling me what to do with this stuff. And so that was many, many years ago now. But that's just not an acceptable answer. We need to continue to challenge ourselves, to push ourselves, and continue to learn to grow. And we also need to know enough to become critical consumers of the professional development opportunities that are made available to us, whether they be through at the provincial level or through our divisions. Critical consumers of the professional development, as well as the resources that our schools may have invested in. So as professionals, we do have an obligation to actively engage in professional improvement. And so I will suggest 3 main areas. These should also look very familiar after these other presentations here today. I would suggest, as teachers, we need to have a solid understanding of the science behind learning to read. And so again, similar to what Dr. Kierstead had previously referred to as content knowledge, we need to understand the what it is that we are trying to teach. I'd also suggest that we focus our professional learning on how to provide structured literacy within our own classroom environments, whatever environment that might be. And as somebody mentioned in the chat earlier, it does look different. It looks different in kindergarten. It looks different in grade 1. It looks different in grade 8 and grade 12. So that learning may look different depending on your context, but we still need to understand how to implement instructional practices that maximize the critical skills that we need to be focusing on in order to teach the content, the science of learning to read. And there's been much talk today all about screening and data. And so there is a place in our classrooms to be making use of the data. And so we need to have some understanding of what these numbers are telling us, how best to read them, who can help us, if it's not making sense. We can have all the systems and mechanisms in place that we want, but if the teachers aren't involved actively, then it's really not going to go anywhere. It needs to be something that we can make use of, and so we need to understand how to make use of it, and data literacy can help us with that. And so one framework that we've heard much about already today is the response to intervention or response to instruction framework. And this framework, I really latched onto it as a teacher myself because it helped me. It brought structure to and understanding to how I could use the data that was coming to me, that we were working so hard to collect. What can I do to make use of it? RTI is really great because you can apply it at all the systems level. We've been talking about provincially, your district, your school, your grade level team can be making decisions using the response to intervention or instruction framework, and then even your own classroom. If you are on your own, trying to forge ahead, you can still make use of this framework to help make data-informed decisions. And so I'm not going to talk about this for too long because I think, as I've mentioned, it's already been well discussed. But there are 5 recommendations, broad strokes recommendations around RTI and how to implement it. The first one, at the universal level, screening all the students and monitoring those students who are at risk. Still at the universal level, we're going to make use of that screening information to help us differentiate our instruction. Some students are going to benefit from and maybe require instruction in addition to their tier 1 instruction. So everybody gets tier 1. Some kids are going to need more than that. And so tier 2 intervention, the recommendation is that it is targeted. Targeted means that it's focused on specific skills, and those skills should be identified through your screening results. We're not pulling them out of a hat. They are identified. We have evidence that this is an area of deficit for our students. We provide the intervention in a systematic way and in generally small groups. And so I know George touched on this earlier today, much ado about should it be in the class, should it be out of the class? As a classroom teacher, if you're engaging your students in small group and targeted instruction, you can be actively a part of the tier 2 process. And then some, in order to ensure that what we're doing is working and we don't have time to waste here, we need to monitor student progress really frequently. Dr. Kierstead talked about once a week. That's a lot, but it's not impossible. And it really, the amount of progress monitoring should be based on the intensity, the level of a support that a student might be requiring, even within your own classroom. So you might be monitoring some students much more often, more frequently than some of your other students. And we do know that there are some students who will require a much more intensive level of support in order to achieve their goals and to show growth. Spinning my mouse the wrong way. There we go. So tier 1, this is our bread and butter as classroom teachers, but it's not the only place where we should be working. Using our screening data, we can be providing differentiated instruction. And so this good evidence-based classroom instruction should be teaching the essential skills and strategies that our students need to have. Here in Alberta, our new English Language Arts and Literature curriculum is a great place to start if you're not sure what those essential skills and strategies are. It should be differentiated based on the assessment results, and we should be flexible and adapt to the students' needs as they're moving forward with instruction or not moving forward, and then we also need to be adaptable to that. We need to provide multiple opportunities for students to practice skills and then to apply those skills. And whether that be in reading or writing or something in math or behavior, we need to provide multiple opportunities to practice. And we can't just cover the curriculum, can't just cover the content. In our tier 1 instruction, we need to ensure that the students are learning what we're teaching. And so we do need to be engaged in progress monitoring at the tier 1 universal level as well. In tier 2, again, this can happen in your classroom, outside of your classroom, but I think that the primary piece of advice I would give if you're trying to implement some targeted instruction, small group instruction, is that be very clear yourself about what it is you are targeting. It cannot be a shotgun blast approach of, boom, we're just going to read, do some reading and try to cover absolutely everything. First of all, you won't have time, you won't do service to anything, and you'll start to feel frustrated, and your students are not going to make the progress that you would hope that they would make. So targeted does mean you need to be able to clearly articulate what skills it is that you are teaching, and then you also need to be able to clearly assess their progress in that area. So the screening or the assessment data, the instructional focus and resources, and the progress monitoring assessments all need to be aligned. We need to be looking at the same things across here. Otherwise, it'll make you bananas. You'll feel frustrated, and you won't be able to do what it is you mean to do. If you're not sure what to target, then a little bit deeper digging into some more diagnostic assessment might be helpful there. If your students are not making the appropriate progress in tier 2, we may need to consider moving up to tier 3. Dr. Kierstead mentioned already some ways in which you can increase the intensity or help make a shift between tier 2 and tier 3. I had heard, even when I first started as a learning support teacher, which was many years ago, but increase the intensity. Let's increase the intensity. And I really did not understand what that meant. And so there are 4 ways that you can increase intensity. I know Dr. Kierstead mentioned a couple of them. The 4 ways that you can increase intensity is you can increase the time. And so Dr. Giorgio said, well, don't keep a kid for an hour. I totally agree. They're not going to be with you for an hour, depending on their age. But you still can increase the amount of time that you are spending with them through multiple pull-asides throughout a day, or you can increase the frequency in other ways as well. Maybe you were working with them 3 times a week. Now, it's definitely going to be 5 times a week. So we can increase the time, we can increase the frequency, you can change the ratio. If they were in a small group, now they get you for some one-on-one FaceTime, and you can narrow the focus. So even though you might have been providing targeted intervention, maybe you were looking at PA, phonics, and some fluency stuff. Let's narrow that even further. So 4 ways that we can increase intensity, even within our own classrooms. And so within the RTI framework, as a classroom teacher, we should know for any given subject which of our students are sitting in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. Within the structure. We should know who they are, and we should also know why they are in that tier. They're in tier 2. Why are they there? What is it that you need to be focusing on? And who else in that list of kids also needs that same kind of focus? And then we can begin our work around grouping students. So I really like the RTI framework. I like it not just for school-wide structure, but also for smaller systems like classrooms. So the big picture is like the content knowledge. Like, what is it actually? How do we teach kids to read? That's the big picture. How is it that people move to become readers? It doesn't matter what you teach or grade. What subjects, what grades, we are all teachers of literacy. Literacy is a part of absolutely every subject that we teach. And so as such, we all have a responsibility to develop our own understanding about the science of learning to read. How is it that these things happen? And this is just such a critical part of our professional learning. And so the simple view of reading is like a great first place to start, but also it's a great place to keep coming back to years and years into your journey as well. So the simple view of reading, very briefly, states that, ultimately, the goal of reading is to comprehend. We read because we want to understand what it is that's on the page. We want to understand it for a variety of purposes. Maybe we're trying to learn something. Maybe we're critiquing something. Maybe we are just going to want to enjoy something. But the ultimate goal is for us to understand what it is that we are reading. And in order for that to happen, we need to have 2 components working optimally. And so those 2 components are word recognition, so the ability to see printed text and then take the words off the page, and oral language comprehension, which is our language skills, our ability to understand spoken language. Both of these things need to be in place, and need to be in place well, in order for us to have success with reading comprehension. If one of these areas is impacted, we will have impacted reading comprehension. If both of these areas are impacted, then we're really going to struggle. But regardless, we need to have both of these components in place in order for us to achieve the goal, which is to be competent, capable readers who can comprehend what we are trying to read. As I believe Dr. Kierstead mentioned, the simple view of reading is beautiful because it's simple. And so when a teacher comes and says, I don't know, they can't understand what they're reading, well, then we can begin the conversation of, well, where in this equation do you think that the breakdown is starting to happen? And then from there, that's just the beginning of the conversation, because really reading is quite a complex process. This is just a great place to begin that conversation. Scarborough's reading rope is another really popular visual that helps us take the simple view of reading and break it out a little bit more into the sub-skills that are involved. And so we can still see those two components, oral language comprehension and word recognition, but now we can begin to unravel the strands to begin to see just how complex these different processes are. And so if, back to that, well, they're just not comprehending, I don't know, well, they didn't read very many of the words correctly. Okay, now we're down into the word recognition component, and now we can start to even have some more conversations. But this is a lot to tackle, generally like in the classroom. And so as Catherine mentioned earlier as well, the National Reading Panel's report, almost 20 or over 20 years old now, outlined for us the big five. Like what is it that we need to be focusing on in our classrooms? And the focus, these are foundational skills, and so the focus may shift and may look different, again, depending on what grade you're teaching your student population. However, the 5 pillars of reading are phonemic awareness, the ability to understand and manipulate, hear the sounds in our words. Phonics, which are the grapheme phoneme correspondences, the letters that represent those sounds, and letter combinations that represent those sounds. Fluency, which is made up of accuracy, automaticity. So are we reading it right? How effortful is it? Can we do it effortlessly? And prosody, which is, attending to punctuation, reading with expression, where are we putting the emphasis on words, etc. Vocabulary, which is, an obvious piece of oral language comprehension. And then comprehension. Comprehension is the pillar, it's also the goal. And so it's represented in here as well as an area where we can focus our instruction. And so for the last section of my presentation, I'm going to break down each of the 5 pillars, use the 5 pillars as my structure, and give a few zoomed out look at key research ideas about how best to approach these within your classroom. So we know they're important, but are there some ways in which we can maximize our efficiency and effectiveness when we're teaching to these particular skills and areas? So these are more big ideas, and again, I hope this can be useful regardless of your teaching context, regardless of whether you're working in kindergarten or in grade 12. And so, using the 5 pillars as a structure, it's worth noting too. I know for those of you not in Alberta, we are talking a lot about the Alberta context, but taking a look here at our 5 pillars of reading, and for those of us familiar with all of these pieces, then comparing that with the new Alberta English Language Arts and Literature curriculum, we can really see a tight correlation. It's very nicely aligned. Obviously, the curriculum goes into other aspects like writing and other areas as well. But I'm really excited as a teacher to see this alignment, because I really think it will make our jobs easier. We need to focus on this, and it's also our curriculum, so that's really handy. It doesn't always happen, as we've also discussed. So what I hope here are to provide are some high impact suggestions that are evidence-based. And again, they're a little bit more zoomed out. They're not super specific. I'm not going to go out and tell you to build a sound wall, for example. So these are a little bit more zoomed out in the interest of hopefully providing something useful to everybody who's listening. So the first pillar, phonemic awareness, there's just so much research on phonemic awareness instruction, and there are so many resources that are also available at cost or also for free for phonemic awareness instruction. What we want to do when we're looking for what is a really effective either practice or program is ensure that when we are teaching phonemic awareness, as often and as soon as possible, we are linking it to phonics. Yes, we can do phonemic awareness without any letters. We can do it in the dark, as people say, and that's fine, but it is more effective when we link it to phonics instruction. So building these opportunities into very explicitly for your students, working on these things together, that will increase your effectiveness, and also it just makes sense like time-wise. The more you can weave together, the better. Now, for some students, you may need to take it a little bit slower, but as soon as possible, let's start linking this to phonics instruction. The most important phonemic awareness skills are blending and segmenting. And so if you're looking at bringing a program in, are they spending enough time on blending and segmenting? Are we spending too much time on other skills, sub-skills like rhyming or something that might not be as critical for reading? So focus on blending and segmenting, and also it's important that that blending and segmenting is happening at the phoneme level, so the individual sound levels. So again, as soon as you can, that's where we need to be focusing our energy with our phonemic awareness instruction. Phonemic awareness is generally an early years instructional focus. And so, if you're an early years teacher, you know that short repeated opportunities is like the name of the game for everything. But really that's the best way to approach phonemic awareness instruction, no matter what. So short repeated opportunities to practice and make use of absolutely every moment that you can. So the first thumbs up note there is to link it to phonics instruction. Yes, when you're intentionally teaching your phonemic awareness, link it to your phonics instruction. But you can also make use of all these little moments throughout your day, especially in the early years where this ought to be your focus, and play some blending and segmenting games during transitions. Do it as movement breaks. I won't play the video. It's super short. It's only like 18 seconds or something, but there is a linked video here from an excellent website called 5 from 5. And so if you grab these slides after, you can take a look at that video, but there's just a masterful teacher making use of absolutely every moment. So she's maximizing her effectiveness with phonemic awareness instruction. I also want to briefly touch on assessment, and I'm not going to talk lots about this because we have talked a lot about assessment. I just wanted to throw it out there that if you're focusing on this in your classroom, in whether it be universally or in some small group work, there's so many resources available online that you can use to help you monitor the progress of your students with this skill. So there are free, the phonological awareness skills test, the PASS, that's free. Make use of what your school already has. Maybe you have a Reading A to Z account. I know lots of schools do. Hey, there's phonological awareness assessments right in there. You don't have to go out and spend a whole ton of money. Here in Alberta, we had many of our early years teachers a few years ago, I guess it's a number of years ago now, but participate in the Reading Readiness Screening Tool training program. Hey, why not pull that tool out if you still have it on your shelf? And then just another plug, although it's been mentioned a few times, the CTOP, so the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, not for classroom teachers. Generally, it's a level B assessment, but it's just a really great tool to have in your arsenal if you are concerned about students, particularly in the early years. The next pillar is phonics, and so I'd like to talk about a few big ideas for phonics instruction. Not surprisingly, the first suggestion is Link it to phonemic awareness. So these two things work really hand in hand and support each other. So development in one can help support development in the other and vice versa. And that is also true for spelling instruction. So, you know, there's lots of talk about reading, but that's the decoding piece, but the encoding, the spelling piece, they're so tightly linked. It only makes sense to tackle these things together. And so if you're engaging in a spelling program, can you manipulate it or use it in a way that supports your phonics instruction as well? And we throw this term around a lot. If you're looking at a phonics program, it needs to be systematic. And, you know, what does that really mean? This, again, is another one of these words where I heard it so many times and I'm like, tell me what that actually means. And, you know, I'm still learning exactly what that means to me too. But systematic, you know, the order in which we are teaching letter sound correspondences or grapheme phoneme correspondences ought to be based on something that makes sense in terms of supporting our students to become readers. So the scope and sequence of the letter sound correspondences needs to be systematic. We cannot rely on, oh, we read a book today that has this particular letter pattern. Let's focus in on this particular letter pattern for this week or whatever. That is not a systematic approach. It needs to be intentional in how it's moving through letter sound correspondences, starting first with ones that are more or used more frequently, so more high frequency letter sound correspondences. But also, let's make sure we get some short vowel sounds in there pretty soon so we can start playing with some words. And a lot of the phonics, the pure phonics programs that are out there these days have a fairly decent, you know, scope and sequence, and they're not all exactly the same. And there is no one exact way scope and sequence to do it in, but it ought to be intentional. The order of the alphabet is not a systematic approach, and it needs to be explicit. What does that mean? Direct instruction. Our brains are not wired to learn this, and so we do actually have to teach it. This is not the time for a more discovery approach to learning. Let's get in there. Let's teach this explicitly, and then let's give multiple opportunities to practice. Not all kids are going to need as much time and practice, but our students who are at risk for difficulties are going to need a lot of practice. And so we need to have programs that have that built in, or access to resources and materials that help us provide that practice. This is an area where if you want to look at bringing in some decodable texts are just like such an easy way to provide practice that's targeted to the actual phonics skill that you were trying to teach. You know, so it just, again, it's about maximizing time and making decisions that help you. It's not about doing more, but just maybe making some shifts so that we're not engaging in practices that are really missed opportunities. So the more that we can align our reading practice with the things that we are actually teaching, the better off our students will be. Phonics assessments, again, if you have, I'm not advocating necessarily for reading A to Z, I know it's in there twice, but my point being, if you already have access to things that are decent and aligned with what you're trying to do, use them. It's not always about the next best thing. So we can still be making use of the tools that are available to us. Also, analyze independent writing. That's an excellent window into how our students are understanding phonics and processing the letter sound correspondences that we're hoping that they're teaching. And then also, I just love a nonsense word or non-word or pseudo word reading assessment. So George talked about that earlier this morning, so I won't go into too much of that, but it's the purest way for us to check in on how our students are doing. Fluency Instruction. So as I mentioned a little bit earlier, fluency is made up of accuracy, automaticity, and prosody. And those three pieces all need to be in place and working together to help a student become a fluent reader. And so these suggestions are a little bit different from the other ones that we have looked at. There's ways that we can support students in developing those. Obviously, accuracy and automaticity, a lot of that's going to come from really solid decoding instructions. So that's a big piece of that, but those are covered in other pillars. One way that we can support our students is through assisted reading. Assisted reading, there's lots of different types of assisted reading. It can be echo reading, choral reading, and there's also lots of different people who can assist. It can be teacher assisted, it could be peer assisted, it could be grade 4 buddy assisted, it could be parent volunteer assisted. The point being that they're able to hear what fluent reading sounds like and then practice it on their own. Repeated reading can sometimes get a bad rap because it can get a little bit misunderstood as reading it over and over and over so we can get faster and faster and faster. Fast reading does not equal good reading, but repeated reading can also be really useful for developing the prosody side as well. So I think, many of us are familiar with reader's theater, for example. Reader's theater, if you're engaged in a reader's theater instructional sequence over a number of days, your students are engaged in repeated reading. They're having multiple opportunities to engage with the same text, try a few different things, see what works, make sure if they've stumbled over a word the first time or second time, well, by the third time, they're probably not stumbling over that word anymore. So repeated reading can look like a lot of different things. It does not have to look like, here's the passage, here's my timer, 30 seconds, go. Now let's do it again, go. Repeated reading is just anytime you're engaging students with the text more than once for specific reading purposes. And then you can also engage in really specific prosody instruction and practice with your students. So, activities around attending to punctuation, playing with punctuation, shifting where we place our emphasis within a sentence, all of these things, phrasing practice activities. These are all activities related to prosody, and prosody can sometimes be the forgotten piece when we think about fluency. And in terms of assessment, again, because we have accuracy and automaticity and we have prosody, we ought to be checking in on those things as well. So easiest way to assess accuracy and automaticity, words correct per minute. And so that would be the time where you put a paper in front of the student, check in how many words did they read correctly in 30 seconds or a minute. But this is only just part of the picture, again, because we don't want to send the message to our students or get caught up in it ourselves that faster equals better. And so prosody is generally assessed using rubrics. There are two commonly used rubrics that are available for free online. There's the NAEP, Oral Reading Fluency Scale, which is like a pretty basic rubric, like general. And then there's also one that's a bit more, breaks it down a little bit more, the multidimensional fluency scale from Mazinski. And that one is also good. And you may find there's no one is better than the other. You may find that for something more general, the general one is good. And if you're trying to dig a little bit deeper, maybe the multidimensional fluency scale is the way to go. But it's the prosody piece is something we want to be keeping in our minds. Vocabulary instruction, I just absolutely love and could go on for days and days. But the big keys are, we want to be, first of all, we need to be intentional with our teaching of it. Okay, so we need to be teaching specific words, and decide to teach specific words. I do see, Catherine, I don't know if you're there, I do see a hand raised.
All right. Monica, do you have a question? You unmute yourself.
That's Monica. Well, the hand went down. Maybe it was unintentional hand raising.
Yeah, okay.
Totally fine. Thanks. So we need to be selecting words to teach like every week. And we need to present these words to our students in various contexts. So we need to be giving them multiple exposures and experiences with these words throughout the week. And so the words that we choose would be great if again, I could go into this in much more detail, but it's best if they're words that they're high impact words. We can use them across multiple contexts. We want to ensure that the activities and the ways in which we're engaging students with these words are active. So they need to be thinking about the words, making decisions about the words. It's not just, gone are the days of look it up in the dictionary, write down the definition, maybe use it in a sentence. Active processing is really, I think the best way for me to say it is they need to be working with the words, making decisions about the words, and then explaining their decisions about the words. And if we engage in this daily with our students in fun and exciting ways, then we're helping our students develop word consciousness, and that's a big key component of vocabulary instruction. And we should be focusing on word meanings as well as morphology. So these are two areas under the vocabulary umbrella that are really high impact things for us to be focusing on intentionally in our classroom. In terms of vocabulary assessment, I think George already kind of touched on this. It's really hard to find like a common vocabulary assessment. But really, if you're teaching vocabulary words, what we want to know is, did they learn the words that I taught? That would make sense. And so one measure you could consider using is the 2-question vocabulary measure from Kearns and B. Myler. This is you create it yourself. For each word that you focused on in that particular week, you create 2 questions. Each word gets 2 questions. One question should be answered with a yes response, and one question should be answered with a no response. Then you take all your questions for all your words, and you mix them all up, and you give them to the students. If students can answer both the questions for each word correctly, then you can be fairly confident that your instruction is successful and they are understanding the word. Cloze activities are another way, a little bit, just another, informal way to assess our students' vocabulary learning. And then, probably more appropriate for older students because if we're asking for writing, using having students respond to questions and give reasons. And you could do that orally, but in the classroom, that would take a long time if you're trying to get through everybody. And then the final pillar, which is a pillar unto itself, but also, as we've discussed, the culmination of all of these things. But there are some suggestions for effective comprehension instruction. The first is strategy instruction does have a place. Absolutely, we should be teaching strategies, but that strategy instruction should be brief, and we teach the strategies explicitly so that students can develop the ability to activate them and employ them implicitly. If you think about yourself, when you're reading a book, very rarely are you going to say, "Oh, now I'm going to stop and visualize this," or "Now I'm going to stop and make a connection to self." We are doing these things, but we're doing them implicitly. So we want to teach the strategies, but these strategy instruction shouldn't take over our entire day. It should be brief, and it should be related to or make sense to the text that's in front of them. So, why are we reading this? And then what strategy would help us to achieve that goal? There are 3 really great high impact strategies that are high impact when employed together, and they're also high impact because they're generalizable across all different types of text. They are predicting, finding the main idea, and summarizing. And so those 3 things working together will support our students' reading comprehension. And also stop quick, for a quick moment here to discuss about the importance of background knowledge. Background knowledge plays such a huge role in reading comprehension. It's not just about what's on the paper, it's about the knowledge of the world that the student is bringing or the individual is bringing to the interaction with the text. And so we can be supporting our students' reading comprehension by helping to develop their background knowledge about the world. And so in the classroom, that means, science matters, social studies matters, health matters, all of these things matter, and developing their understanding of these pieces and content will then help them to be better comprehenders when we ask them to read a passage that has something to do about these topics. And so we can support students with that also by providing domain-specific reading. So using our, again, if we're in elementary or generalist ability to be reading about all of the different things that we're learning about in our other subject areas, and using those types of materials also to support our strategy instruction while also developing background knowledge. Again, the more that we can weave together and intertwine, the better use of time we'll be making. And vocabulary development, again, and so that's just so important for reading comprehension, so it's in there twice. One more note about domain-specific reading. If you're looking to make a shift, you have your classroom library currently organized by level. This could be a way to shake things up a little bit. Take all your books out and organize them maybe by subject rather than level. And then, you've got a kid who's interested in this, or you want to help develop background knowledge in this. Hey, go check out this bin. So just a specific suggestion for how to shake things up. Comprehension assessment is also really challenging. Commercially available assessments are just not that great because of the fact that it's about this interaction between the kid and their experiences, everything they're bringing, and then the text that's put in front of them. Also, maybe it becomes a word reading task rather than, assessment rather than a comprehension assessment. So the best advice I could give based on the learning that I've done is, as much as possible, connect your comprehension assessment to your other subject area content. And that way, you're sort of leveling the playing field of background knowledge for everybody. You can assess what they know about that content, and you can also assess how well they were able to comprehend a particular type of text. And then again, just sort of going back to that question of access to curriculum not being a barrier, also access to expressing your understanding not being a barrier, allowing students to provide various ways of demonstrating what they've understood. So whether that be speaking or writing or some other creative project is another way to ensure that lack of spelling ability or lack of reading ability doesn't impact their ability to show you what they learned. And so, just to briefly wrap up, there are so many learning opportunities available, and some of them have been mentioned already. Something that hasn't been mentioned, so I would maybe put a plug in for that, is a subscription to a highly respectable research journal or something really useful. These can be expensive, but I bet if you approached a school administrator with a plan for something like this, maybe some PD money, could go to support like a school-wide subscription or something like that. But that's a really great way to sort of plug into, what's the latest information. Key books and websites, I think books especially, these will depend on where you are in your journey, what books are going to be speaking most to you. But those professional social media groups, like the Facebook groups that Matthew mentioned, are chock full of suggestions. And find some allies, find your peers in your school, people that you can lean on, but also people that are going to challenge you and question you and encourage you to continue growing. That's the best kind of peer support that you could receive, I think, from colleagues. And consider continuing your formal education, whether that be through a open studies course, an online thing, or registering for something more formal like a master's or a doctorate program. That's our professional responsibility to continue growing and learning. And with that, I will pass it back to Catherine.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was an amazing presentation. I want to thank you for your time and everything you put into that. And I think one of the things that I want to highlight is that these 5 pillars aren't being taught in isolation, right? And you brought up the importance of the phonics being integrated with the phonological awareness instruction and working on it throughout the day in different subject areas. One thing that I think you'll agree with is that we want to make sure that the spelling instruction follows the phonics instruction and it's integrated, because what's going to help our students orthographically map the words that we're teaching them. And we're not just asking them to decode, we're asking them to encode. So decoding is sounding it out, and decoding is sounding it out and putting it together to get to the word. Encoding is when we're sounding it out and trying to figure out the letter sound correspondences or the grapheme phoneme correspondences we need to write them down in written text. So that's something that we want to make sure that we use in our instruction. And another thing that we can use to inform our instruction is looking at our students' work. Yes, there are great screening measures available. They do take time. It is sometimes a challenge, but as you train yourself to look for commonalities, like when you're correcting, say if you do a spelling test or written assignments with your students, and you notice a common area that you're seeing errors, even if it's something that you thought you taught, then you're being responsive to your instruction, right? And understanding, okay, I need to go back and readdress this more.
I think, just going back to that idea of the pillars as not being these isolated pieces, I think in some ways, I'll speak personally. I didn't speak too much personally about my own journey, but for me, that was very helpful when I was initially starting on this journey, was developing an understanding of what each of these pillars were, sort of unto themselves. And for me, the next step in my learning and my professional growth has been then examining how I can start to bring these pieces together so that they're supporting each other. And so I think, I know I went so hard on PA, phonemic awareness, and was like, yeah, we're going to do it. And that was fine, because that's where I was in my journey. And now, having learned a little bit more, now I'm able to start to see how these pieces really fit together and how I can help my students fit them together. And so there are different, for me, different stages that I've moved through and will continue to move through. Absolutely.
I think it's also important to highlight that this is a process of learning. To learn all of this stuff, all the things that you spoke up about, the science of reading and looking at data analysis and the science of screening, that's not something that you're going to learn over the summer. It's going to take time, and it's okay to bring in different elements in small chunks and get comfortable with that instead of completely throwing everything out and starting anew. That's going to burn you out very quickly. And there are little bits that you can do, focus on the phonological awareness and the phonics in the lower grades so you can get that result. But even for the vocabulary instruction, maybe you're not formally working with a program and a strategy necessarily. You're focusing on that phonics and phonological awareness. But one of the greatest ways that we can help our students learn new vocabulary is by using it when we're in conversation, when we're speaking with them, right? So if we try to be conscious about that, it takes a little bit of time at the beginning, but then you recognize in the changes that you're seeing in your classroom, and it becomes easier and more natural for you to use some of those tier 2 words that have a high value in learning because they're used across topic areas, but they're not ones that they're just going to get when they're having a conversation with their friend.